History does not always announce its turning points with fanfare or flame. Sometimes they arrive quietly, like a shift in the wind, barely felt until the world around you begins to move in ways no one can stop. In the summer of 1776, the British Empire, powerful, wealthy, feared on every sea and every shore, believed the American rebellion was nearing its end. Officials in London spoke confidently of victory. Generals in New York wrote letters dripping with certainty. Loyalists whispered that the rebels were starving, exhausted, dissolving into chaos. Yet beneath that calm surface, the land itself was stirring. In backwoods cabins, smoky taverns, icy northern camps and dense forests, American determination hardened instead of fading. Washington, whose army had survived on hope more than supplies, sensed that the British grip was tightening too quickly, too confidently, too carelessly. He knew empires often collapse not under the weight of enemy blows, but under the arrogance of believing those blows cannot harm them. In Brooklyn Heights, 3 British generals believed the collapse imminent. William Howe, confident and disciplined; Henry Clinton, ambitious and calculating; and Lord Charles Cornwallis, ruthless and feared. They believed the Continental Army would crumble. They were wrong. The night battle began. Cannons roared, muskets flared. The Americans, though outnumbered, fought with desperate courage. But by dawn, Brooklyn was lost. Washington's forces had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and nearly annihilated. The army teetered on the edge of destruction. And yet, somehow, they survived, though only by the slimmest margin, under the cover of darkness and a daring evacuation across the East River. The army had escaped Brooklyn, but the danger had only shifted. Across the water, the fog of the East River promised sanctuary, if only Washington could guide his men through it without panic or mistake. The night had survived, but the war's first true test was only beginning. Midnight had fallen like a curtain over Brooklyn Heights. The city below was silent, broken only by distant British patrols and the occasional muffled shout of a soldier lost in the shadows. Washington moved among his men like a ghost, boots sinking into the rain-soaked mud, coat drenched, hat pressed low against the wind, his eyes scanning the river and the barely visible skyline across the East River. Escape. That single word had become the measure of all hope. Without survival, the revolution would die in the cold dark of August, before it had fully begun. Orders were whispered from officer to officer. Men scurried through the darkness, gathering every available boat, fishing sloops, flat-bottomed barges, anything with a hull sturdy enough to hold trembling men. Each vessel was loaded quietly, carefully, the soldiers' muskets clattering softly against wooden planks. Lanterns were hidden, lest a stray glimmer betray them to the thousands of British troops circling the river. Washington waited until the last units were ready. He did not step into a boat first. He walked along the shoreline, counting, whispering, checking. Every face reflected the same mixture of fear, exhaustion, and determination that weighed upon the general himself. One misstep, one shout, one errant cannon blast, and the army, all that remained of the American cause, would be swept into the river or captured. Then, as if the world itself conspired in their favor, the fog descended. It crept across the river like a living thing, thick and suffocating, cloaking the fleet of boats, masking every movement, hiding the Americans from thousands of eyes trained to find them. Washington's heart lifted. Time, the only thing he could never control, had granted them a reprieve. The crossing began. Oars dipped into the water silently, rhythmically, carrying soldiers across the churning black river. Some men froze at the sight of the waves, icy and merciless, threatening to overturn their fragile craft. Officers steadied them, whispering encouragement, tightening their grips on the ropes. Washington moved among them, a presence more than a commander, more than a man, the living embodiment of hope and resolve. Hours passed. One boat after another glided across the East River, invisible under the dense shroud fog. British sentries leaned against railings, cannons primed, but the mist swallowed every shape, every sound. By morning, the last soldier had crossed. Brooklyn Heights was abandoned, left to the British, silent, but haunted by what had transpired. Washington's army had survived, a threadbare, battered remnant, yet alive in that quiet triumph. He understood something that would guide him for the rest of the war. Survival is often the first, most critical victory. The East River miracle had bought the revolution a future, but New York still stood, and the British were far from finished. The next move would demand more courage, more risk, and more audacity than any army, any nation, or even he had yet endured. The night had been won, but the war was far from over.
New York, in the late summer of 1776, was a city poised between chaos and conquest. Narrow streets funneled the morning light into long, shadowed alleys. Smoke from wood fires twisted into the sky, carrying the scent of bread, sweat, and fear. Half the city whispered loyalty to the crown, the other half whispered hope for the revolution. And in the middle, George Washington's army struggled to regroup, their numbers thinned, their spirits frayed. The British, confident and merciless, had followed swiftly. Their ships, a floating forest of masts and sails, crowded the harbor. Cannons boomed from warships anchored offshore, shaking wharfs, rattling glass, sending startled pigeons into the air. Redcoats poured from Brooklyn, boots striking cobblestones in measured, terrifying rhythm. Every movement, every shout, every drumbeat reminded the Americans that they were on the edge of annihilation. Washington knew the city could not be defended. The terrain favored the British. Their numbers outmatched his by more than half. Yet surrender was unthinkable. To give New York without a fight was to tell the world the revolution was already lost. The battle began. Artillery fire tore through wooden homes, sending shards and timber into the air. Militiamen tried to hold key intersections, but panic spread faster than bullets. Columns of British soldiers slipped through the gaps in the American lines, driving retreat after retreat. Smoke hung low, a suffocating fog hiding horrors in every quarter. Amid the chaos, Washington rode through the smoke like a figure from a dream. Musket balls whistled past him. Civilians ducked behind doors. Officers struggled to rally broken units. Washington's voice, calm and commanding, cut through the panic. "Stand, hold, do not give them the streets." Yet even he could feel the tide slipping through his fingers. By nightfall, the remnants of the army had escaped Manhattan. Fires burned in the streets, casting eerie light across broken bridges and abandoned fortifications. The city's surrender was complete, yet Washington had preserved something far more important than the land: the army itself, battered but alive, still capable of fighting, still capable of surviving. The British believed the war was over. They celebrated in the streets, thinking that crushing Washington's army would end the revolution. They were wrong. From the shadows of defeat, the seeds of America's resilience had already rooted. And Washington, his army safe for the night, knew the coming months would demand every ounce of cunning, courage, and audacity he had left. Because the next battles would not just decide New York, they would decide whether the revolution would survive at all.
The summer of 1776 had burned itself into memory, leaving only smoke, mud, and the taste of fear. Washington's army, battered and broken, retreated northward through the forests and farmlands of New Jersey, a threadbare column of men clinging to survival. Every step, every mile was haunted by the thunder of British brutes behind them. Every village they passed held eyes and ears that reported to the enemy. Every moment carried the possibility that the revolution could end in a single decisive stroke. The retreat was relentless. British generals pursued with a determination born of certainty. Skirmishes erupted at Kiff's Bay, White Plains, and Fort Washington. Each encounter shredded morale further. Cannons roared, muskets barked, and then fell into rivers, ditches, and forests in exhaustion or fear. Washington watched helplessly as the remnants of his once proud army dispersed, surrendering guns, wagons, and the illusion of invincibility. Fort Washington became the breaking point. On November 16th, the British struck with brutal precision. 2,800 Americans, the elite defenders of the fort, were captured in a single morning. The loss was staggering, a wound so deep that whispers of despair spread through every encampment. Soldiers huddled in barns and woods, boots torn, uniforms soaked, their eyes haunted. Officers carried news of defeat along narrow roads, their voices cracking as they tried to steady the shaken troops. Washington felt the blow keenly, his chest tight, his mind racing. He had lost a fortress, yes, but worse, he had lost the illusion of control. Yet the retreat continued. Nights were long, rain-soaked and bitterly cold. Men marched with frostbitten fingers clutching meager rations of bread and water. Wagons broke under weight and mud. Horses stumbled and fell. Some soldiers whispered of desertion, others simply vanished into the forests. Washington never faltered. He rode among them, checking fires, offering words of encouragement, maintaining the fragile thread of discipline that still held the army together. Every night he asked himself the same question: how do you keep a shattered army from becoming an army of ghosts? How do you preserve hope when the world seems determined to crush it? By December, fewer than 3,000 men remained fit for duty. New York was occupied, nearly every strategic position in New Jersey had fallen to the British, and Congress had fled Philadelphia. Across the colonies, newspapers proclaimed the war lost. Yet Washington's resolve hardened. Amid the freezing winds and relentless pursuit, he devised a daring plan: a winter attack, a gamble that could either save the revolution or destroy it entirely. The army, tired, cold, and hungry, would cross the ice-choked Delaware River and strike at the enemy when they least expected it. The great gamble was about to begin, and the fate of the revolution rested on it.
The night of December 25th, 1776, fell with a silence that felt unnatural, almost sacred. Snow covered the banks of the Delaware River, a thick, icy blanket that muffled footsteps and disguised movement. The wind cut through men's coats, through their soaked boots, through every layer of exhaustion that clung to Washington's army like a second skin. They were tired, hungry, ragged, and small in number, fewer than 2,400 soldiers fit for duty. By every measure, this army should have been defeated. By every measure, the revolution should have ended. Yet Washington saw an opportunity in desperation. He knew the Hessians in Trenton, elite mercenaries hardened by European wars, were celebrating Christmas. Their guard would be lighter, their vigilance dulled by wine, by cheer, by the arrogance of believing the rebellion crushed. And so, against the warnings of his officers, against the common sense of retreat, Washington ordered the impossible: a crossing of the ice-choked Delaware River. The river was alive with danger. Slabs of ice scraped against the hulls, splintering timber and threatening to overturn fragile craft. Men rowed in near darkness, muscles screaming, teeth chattering, eyes straining through mist and snow. Horses shivered, wagons groaned under impossible weight. Cannons threatened to tip with each sway of the boats.
Every second was a choice between survival and annihilation. Washington refused to panic. He moved along the riverbank, speaking quietly to men whose fear mirrored his own, offering a presence that steadied them. By midnight, the army was across. Every man, every cannon, every horse, a miracle made real by discipline, courage, and sheer will. By dawn, the march began. The snow crunched under tired feet. Breath hung in the cold morning air. The Americans advanced with a mixture of hope and terror. They crept through Trenton, shadows among shadows, until the Hessians, unprepared and overconfident, were caught off guard. The battle was brief but decisive. Cannons roared, muskets barked, panic spread through the streets. By sunrise, more than 900 Hessians were captured. The Americans lost fewer than 5 men. For the first time in months, the army had tasted victory. Washington had gambled with everything, and against all odds, he had won. The revolution had survived the night, but the danger was far from over.
After Trenton, the fragile pulse of the revolution quickened. Washington's army, battered but alive, had tasted victory, and with that victory came a new understanding. Survival alone was not enough. The British, humiliated but unbroken, would strike back. The war was far from over. Yet for the first time, the rebels sensed that the impossible might be within reach. A second strike, bordering on madness, was planned. A march across the icy Delaware River once more, targeting Princeton. The men, cold, hungry, and exhausted from Trenton, knew the stakes. Each step carried the weight of the revolution itself. Each breath was a gamble against frostbite, starvation, and death. On the night of January 2nd, 1777, Washington's forces left winter quarters. Snow crunched beneath boots. Horses shivered. Cannons were secured with ice-laden chains. Fog clung low to the ground as if shielding them from enemy eyes. Every movement was orchestrated with precision born of desperation. By dawn, the Americans approached Princeton, the town bathed in pale winter light. British troops, believing the Continental Army pinned elsewhere, were caught off guard. Musket fire erupted. Cannons roared. Washington led from the front, riding into chaos, voice carrying over smoke and shouts, "Push forward, do not falter." The British were routed. The rebels captured weapons, supplies, and prisoners. Morale soared. News of the victory spread rapidly. Soldiers who had once despaired now felt unbroken. Princeton, like Trenton before it, proved that courage and audacity could overcome superior numbers. The army settled into winter quarters with renewed confidence. Though still outnumbered and outgunned, men had regained hope. Washington's gamble had transformed desperation into momentum, chaos into strategy, and retreat into opportunity.
Winter began to loosen its grip, and the American army emerged from the shadows of retreat and despair. Washington's men, hardened by frost, hunger, and relentless pursuit, were no longer the shattered remnants that had stumbled across the Delaware months before. They had been tempered by fire, sharpened by adversity, and united by a leader who refused to yield. The victories at Trenton and Princeton were statements of survival. News spread through the colonies, rekindling faith in a cause that had teetered on the edge of collapse. Patriots who had doubted, civilians who had feared, and soldiers who had faltered now whispered the same truth. America can endure. America can fight. America can win. Yet Washington knew endurance alone would not be enough. The British, humiliated but unbroken, were regrouping, gathering reinforcements, and planning renewed assaults. The young nation still faced a formidable enemy. One misstep could erase months of painstaking survival. Washington acted with measured audacity.
He rotated the army through winter quarters, repaired supplies, trained new recruits, and reinforced discipline. He also kept the spirit of initiative alive, sending scouting parties, launching small strikes, and maintaining the illusion of strength, even in weakness. Every movement was a calculated act of defiance, every march a statement that America would not crumble under pressure. By spring, momentum had shifted. Soldiers who had once fled in fear now held their ground with quiet confidence. Towns that had anticipated occupation instead greeted the army as liberators. The British, frustrated by evasive maneuvers, miscalculations, and unexpected resilience, faced a forced learning, adapting, and growing stronger under pressure. Washington had transformed defeat into strategy, retreat into opportunity, and despair into hope. The revolution had been saved not by overwhelming numbers, not by perfect supplies, not by certainty of outcome, but by perseverance, courage, and the unyielding will of a single man who refused to accept defeat. The story of 1776 is not of conquest, nor of decisive victories on open fields. It is the story of survival, of a nation nearly lost yet preserved through audacity, risk, and relentless determination. From the brink of catastrophe, America endured, and in that endurance, history was forever changed.